Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. So, I was thinking about the game The Last of Us, and what I really found unique in the old rendition is you get this discussion between Tess and Joel and how it looks as well when you're in the traveling mode to go and get Robert, that there is food rationing happening. And the way it looks is there's a blocked off zone, and Fedra, who is fighting against the Fireflies, has enacted martial law. And the food rations are getting less and less, and it appears that Tess and Joel covet these sort of food ration cards. What I found to be quite fascinating about the food rationing angle of this game and how that would relate to an infection apocalypse is just how sensitive the food supply is, and how if you start to focus on food security today, you will get heavily mocked by city folk, and you'll be called all sorts of names. And if you start to have like food rations, or you start to tell people to have some type of front garden, they mock you. And it highlights to me how out of touch we've become with food. And more, when you look at starvation, people will say, well, you need water. But at the same time, some places have a lot of rain, and each season you can get a decent harvest if you do it right. And I was thinking further about snow. Like, if you think about how some places snow, why can't you scoop up snow, it melts, and then you send it to a sanitation plant and then have that as a source of like gathering rainwater and scooping up snow and taking it? There's literally Antarctica. There's places full of snow. So if you really need water, you can find a way to get that water without taking salt out of the ocean water. So I don't really buy this narrative that we're running out of water, because I think that's just a scare tactic. We have all this technology and stuff, but it doesn't appear that people want to fix food and water security. Further, I've talked about this in the past, how I'm going to add some points here to kind of paint the picture. People who would plant, imagine every yard has 3 plants, right? Or rather, let me put it this way, trees. You got avocado tree, you have an almond tree, walnuts, citruses, a pineapple, something going on where you're growing some type of food. Imagine someone has a backyard, you got 4 apple trees. Just the whole bartering system and allowing people to grow food instead of lawns. Because in some places, they don't let you grow food in your front area. They talk about water rationing. But if you really sit back and think about, if every single house grew some type of food item, and even if you didn't want to pick it and eat it, if you gave it to a food shelter, then a lot of people would be fed. And even growing foods on rooftops of these tall, dystopian New York City places, or designing buildings and then on the side you have flowers and different things like that, herbs, and then you harvest it and then you can sell it, like parsley, cilantro, basil, mint, stuff like that, chamomile, even dandelion. You would let it grows, it's really beautiful, then you harvest it. There's like living walls, they call it. Tons of stuff can be done, right? Literally tons of stuff can be done in order to fix food security. And when you see how much food gets wasted from restaurants, you again see that there's a mismanagement of that. It should be the law that if you are selling food, before dumping it in the trash, there should be some type of trucks that come by they take it, and then the people who need it the most can line up and take that, and you don't just chuck it up and chuck it away. Further, look how many seeds are in a kiwi, how many seeds are in a pineapple, in an orange, even a mandarin orange. You begin to notice that there's so many seeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us inside of a pumpkin, butternut squash, spaghetti squash, acorn squash. It's alarming to think, how are we still starving when we are given so much bounty? There's so much soil out there that you could plant an entire orchard and just have it be an anarchy. Sow some tomato seeds, like just having food as landscape, right? Things that are edible. It really just goes to show you that people don't want a solution. So in the game, The Last of Us, when you see how important food becomes and how farming and hunting are really important in such a state for survival, and how when food gets tight, people look to a hero who's going to secure food, and what people will do for food, because it's either you sit and starve and watch your kids perish, or you secure food by the means you need to take. And then I started thinking further about, if you were in a situation like that, the pollution of the ocean is a huge problem, right? I started wondering, why aren't they fixing the pollution in the oceans? Because even if you were in an apocalyptic situation like that, if you got a fishing rod or a net, you can eat pretty good. But if the water's all polluted and no one knows how to hunt, and you've killed all the deer and there's no habitat, not even birds to eat, wild turkeys and stuff, that's going to be another problem. Because food rations of, like, in the game, looking for canned food and stuff like that, you're going to have a problem. How valuable tomato seeds would come, and how slow food takes to grow in some circumstances. And how you have to secure food in order to keep feeding your empire. And so it's fascinating to think how we have the truck systems now of bringing planes of food in, like you're gonna get bananas from Ecuador. It's really strange how we don't focus on local communities producing food in farmers markets. And there's a lot of zoning laws, as I mentioned so many times, about you can't plant this, or people who have apartment complexes, why not plant a pear tree? Like, why is it always things you can't eat? Right? It's amazing to me, truly. They say it brings wildlife sometimes, but what's wrong with that? You can eat squirrels. Well, I don't know if us Muslims can. Because can you count a squirrel's hands as claws? Because they climb trees? I'm not sure. But in times of starvation, if there's a good bird population that's sustained by insects, and insects come because of fruit trees sometimes, well, then you can not starve, right? And ducks gotta have something to eat. Big juicy duck, geese, seagulls, you name it. You can have something to eat if the water bodies are maintained. And so I really enjoyed in this game how it highlighted the importance of food, and how whoever secures the food is going to have the most power. And if people have to rebel against their government who can't feed them, they're going to have to hope that there's some food out there that they can eat. The fascinating thing about that further is, in the game, when you see food rations, and then later you meet David the cannibal, and how badly they want Ellie's deer that she got, you begin to see how the posh liberal vegans who want to have the factories make fake meat wouldn't survive in a situation like that. Highly processed food that has a long supply chain isn't going to really make it very well. So vegans are going to truly suffer. Vegans by choice, right? Because now in the modern society, you can get that crap tofurkey and all that stuff that causes indigestion and irritable bowel syndrome. And it's very unhealthy. The Impossible Burger meat garbage. That wouldn't work because no one's running the factories, right? And when you go to eat a wild elk that you were able to hunt in some type of apocalyptic situation, you'd become more grateful. And you have to have the vegetation and the water to sustain those critters. And in a situation like that, you'd begin to see that meat is so important for nutrition, right? The circle of life and all that. So if the people in a situation like The Last of Us can break out of their quarantine areas and just go off into the woods and get proper food, they're actually better off than looking to the federal government for their help. And I think that's another example of what we would face as Americans in a situation like that, because governments that cannot control food and keep a steady supply of it, they'll at the top have it while those on the bottom won't. And I think that's another example of why we should plant more fruit trees, have more community gardens, empty hills where there's literally no houses. Why can't the states plant fruit trees there? People can just go there and get some. Like, why not rent those out? Like plots of land. Like, hey, you can have this amount of space, but you have to grow food, and you get it for this many seasons, right? It would be so smart for people to really start connecting with their food supply. And preserving forests. I often also had this idea of, why can't you just have like wild chickens? Like, chickens, when they're in the wild, they eat bugs, they do pretty well. Why can't like we just have wild chickens in some forests, introducing rabbits and different things into the ecosystem as a sort of emergency food supply? It really makes you wonder about, in such a scenario, you would beg and plead to come across a big fat duck who's just sitting there, and the ability to catch it and then know how to cook it all up and process it. And further, even ice fishing, right? People eating frogs. You begin to notice how desperate people get when the food runs out. Desert climates, you don't really have a whole bunch of choice. But in places where there's actually forests, you can introduce populations and then look at the water cycle and see what can be maintained there. But food security is possible. It's just controlled. And people are often lazy that they don't want to grow anything and start up that system. So if such a situation happened, I think you would see a big wiping of people due to starvation. But past generations, they, I think, understood, because the Great Depression in America, I think people understood famine more. And people who live in winter climates, they often plan more for the future, and they often have extra food. And in the game, The Last of Us, because there's food rations, and food is hard to come by, like with Sam and Henry, you see them counting their cans of food. You notice, like, this would be an intense situation for people, and canned foods are great, but after that, you gotta go back to knowing how to hunt, knowing where to find food, and hoping that the wild animals are still out there. Food in the game really was quite accurate. How you have to scavenge for it, the federal agents having food ration cards, and when in The Last of Us 2, when Ellie and Dina and the baby are on their farm and they have sheep, you begin to see, like, yes, the ability to get milk, wool, and meat from sheep is very valuable. And then you begin to see the value of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us animals to eat, and how really retarded vegans are with how they think that you don't have a right to use the wool and make leather from the animal, or create bone broth, or use their blood to fertilize your soil, stuff like that. They think you shouldn't do that at all. The vegan world could not survive. No one would be in such a situation. And some vegans even won't let you eat honey because they say that the bees cannot consent. It comes from a living being, and they don't like the way honeycombs are taken from the hive, so you shouldn't even eat honey. And honey has immense benefits. So the woke, liberal, soft, posh attitude and the starvation fetish of veganism is not really going to work in a world like The Last of Us. So food rationing in this game really is intelligently done, because it makes you appreciate the ability to have food and exposes the faults in our own way of living. It's quite fascinating. I really hope that more people will just plant food trees. You know, if you're able to, you can just go plant one. Like, have a little sapling or whatever. And, you know, you go plant it and you water and you care for it. And then when the seasons come, it grows on its own. And there should be more programs where you're planting more of those kinds of foliage that produce sustenance. But again, a population that has food security is more free. If you notice that the farmers, like when they're able to get food for themselves, they are more free than those who are in a tiny apartment, thousands of dollars in debt, are addicted to wine and pills, and they don't have any children, and they have a broken family. They're totally ruined. And all they have is their TikTok attitudes. You would see who would fare the best in a sort of infected apocalypse such as that. And you also begin to see during the lockdowns that we had people lining up in the food bank line because the government wouldn't allow us to work, and people lost all their savings. And now when you look at it, they didn't build more hospitals, they didn't bring in the military, they just took away your job, and the unemployment wasn't enough, and it was a mess. So people had less money to buy food and had to depend on food banks, and food banks were first come first serve. So when I was in those lines, I was like, wow. And the website crashed, the government website crashed because so many people were going online. And if America gets hit with a cyber attack, you're not able to go on unemployment, you're not able to do that, and there's mass looting, and you don't have your own food supply, and you were embarrassed to buy emergency food, well, you would really suffer. Because if you're not breastfeeding your baby, you need formula now. Otherwise, your baby is gonna starve. And that's, I think, the other aspect of food rationing, at least in The Last of Us. Women who will breastfeed babies are keeping babies alive. Think about that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave women breasts to feed their babies. If you are in an apocalyptic situation like that, the babies who don't nurse and the women who can't nurse, that is gonna cause a problem. It's quite fascinating. Quite fascinating. So think about how in such a game you would be able to see, hey, where would I fit in this? And remember, in that game, things break off immediately. And I always thought it was strange how when Joel and Tommy are leaving with Sarah, that they didn't pack any food. Because to me, when I think of survival, I think of food, right? And I like to watch these bushcraft videos, and they often show you foraging and stuff. But if we allow too much of our forest to be torn down, and we don't start building more sustainable environments and living things, I think we would have a big problem, right? Having all these people crammed together in these horrible looking apartments, you would then be able to see how those people leaving the cities, crossing the bridges and going into other communities who are like hordes of hungry people will come and just tear up your field. And so the concept of private property and being able to lethally defend your property is important. And even if you were starving, you have to know, how do you even break down the chicken? How do you know if the chicken's healthy, right? You'll see people who go fishing in Alaska and there's like these worms in the fish, and you're like, how do you get rid of that? It's amazing how we don't seem to want to fix food, and instead they do genetically engineered food, and that Monsanto and them Ready Roundup causes cancer. So they just pour chemicals and engineer stuff, and then food causes cancer, and it's like Frankenfood, when you can literally just help people get food by planting literally more trees and more foodstuffs. So for example, like let's say a hospital, they're gonna plant some really pretty trees. Nothing wrong with having some, non-fruit bearing trees, but throw in some cherries. Like, oh, it made a mess on the ground. But think about how many seeds for free right there. And there's a balance of birds and stuff that eat it. It's really just like this beautiful ecosystem. Beautiful ecosystem. So maybe in your own communities or in your own property, instead of having grass, put some plants in there. Watermelons, squashes, pumpkins, cantaloupe, you name it. There's so many things we could plant. And even thinking about pine trees, when they drop their pine cones, you dry those buggers out, you can use it for firewood. Just think about all the resources we have. It's quite fascinating when you think about it. Truly it is. And when games hint at food rationing, I think we underestimate the power of hunger and the ability of people to become cannibals, right? The ability of people to want to eat dogs and cats and go crazy because they can't eat really tells you something. And the amount of bodies that would pile up due to starvation, it would be really intense. And further, think about this. The government, if in such a situation they couldn't get voluntary farmers, they would put you on a field and make you work that field in order to increase food rationing. It's really excellent mental exercise to think how you would survive such a situation like The Last of Us. Let me know what you think, because the game brings out a lot of ideas around food and how our brains are always kind of seeking food, like a squirrel hiding its nut and then going back to it later on. And then squirrel forgets one nut and it grows into a tree, which helps to grow more nuts. So the acorn tree, it's fascinating. I really do think we have to focus on food security more. It's nice when you think how in some communities you'll just see a chicken just there with its chicks. But in some areas they'll say like, oh, we can't have chickens because they bring rats. But then if there's rats and you don't kill all the owls and hawks and turkey vultures, they're gonna eat them. And if you don't kill all the snakes will eat them too. And there just continuously appears to be a balance. And plus cats and small terrier dogs will totally kill rats. But in New York, where there's no trees, so where's the hawks and them gonna live? Where the owls gonna live? There's all this garbage and all these rats bringing disease because there's no predators for the rats. There's garbage, but there's nowhere for the predator birds to live. So humans created these ugly cities with very little plants and trees to sustain wildlife, and now they're plagued with rats that bring disease, and humans won't be able to stop producing garbage. So it just goes to show how we can have so many solutions that create a better environment for us, but we don't really understand it. So let me know what you think as well. I try to bring in all these topics to kind of show you what I thought and to help you see my perspective. But what would you do for a food rations card? In prison, you know, people trade food. They get a commissary. They really want their snacks. If you owe somebody chips and you don't pay up, it's like a big thing. Twinkies, those little treats like the donuts. We would be surprised how far people will go for food. And I appreciate food, and I love food. And I think we have to start raising children with more respect for where their food comes from, and to not look down upon growing food ourselves in some capacity, and to be proud. Even if it's a small tea garden, it's still better than nothing. Very interesting. By the way, I'm still fundraising for my bookshelf, my book holder thing in the wooden panel, and if you'd like to help out with that, it'd be great. It's on my blog. You can do a tip function or just join the blog. It's $5, and it's www.subscribestar.com/Milahan Archive. Hope to see you there.